Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Coaching Crowd podcast with me, Jo Wheatley, and my friend and co-host, Zoe Hawkins.
Hello, everybody. Good to be back again. And today we are going to be talking to you about ethical coaching because ethics is at the center of great coaching. And it's sometimes the unsung hero in coaching doesn't get as much airtime and focus as it needs to. And with it being such an important part of coaching, it really does help to guide our practice as coaches and practitioners. So we just wanted to spend a bit of time on that with you today.
And I think even though the profession has its own global code of ethics, and the three coaching bodies, two of them subscribe up to the global code of ethics and one has their own, it's the interpretation of those codes that really are the bit that we need to get into and to understand as coaches, because like all frameworks, they can feel a bit out of context. So today's podcast episode, we're going to give you some examples of some ethical dilemmas, some of the questions that you can ask yourself to keep yourself working as an ethical coach.
And it's probably worth starting by mentioning that the coaching industry is unregulated, which is why ethics actually forms a really important part of practice. And so all the main coaching bodies are there to help to raise the standards of the profession and to provide, guidance in terms of our competence. So there are competency frameworks, and the code of ethics is one which helps to guide our decision making around what is and isn't ethical, or what is and may not be ethical. And as Jo alluded to there, really it's about our judgment as coaches and practitioners that needs to be developed in the framework of ethics, because we are ultimately the ones that have to make decisions about what we do or don't do, depending on the situations that arise. So for anybody who is interested in coaching and thinking about coaching, it's worth doing your research around these codes of ethics to see what are the expected standards and some of the guiding principles by which we do our work.
Yeah, so perhaps let's start by talking about some of the situations that can arise that can, trigger for us the question either in the moment with the client or outside of that, where we might take it to supervision and say, this is happening, or I've been asked to do this and I'm not sure. Can we talk it through?
I think a really common one that comes up is where you have an organization who is sponsoring the coaching for a leader, and perhaps they're sponsoring that coaching for succession planning or for talent development. And then when you get to the coaching, the leader is feeling like they are at a career crossroads and doesn't know whether to continue their career within that organization, because that ultimately is a bit of a conflict of interest. Like, who is your client? You have the organization who is paying for you to coach, and you have your client who is coming in and giving their time and commitment to the sessions. So that can pose a conflict of interest, an ethical dilemma that you as the coach needs to navigate.
Yeah, and then we've got situations where the coaching relationship, maybe there's an attraction, that as the coach is noticing, or the coach feels that the coachee might be feeling attracted in a romantic way to you as the coach. What do you do about that situation? Or situations where you might be invited to coach people who are in the same family. And it's not to say that it's not ethical, but it's definitely something that you want to pause and stop and reflect on, and probably, as I say, discuss it with your supervisor, making sure that you've got full perspectives on it before you make your choice.
Yep, you might have situations where you are sensing that your client is becoming dependent on the coaching. So that can create some tension and some ethical dilemmas. And then there's other things around whistleblowing, for example. So if you're with a client and they disclose something to you with the intent of whistleblowing, how do you handle those situations? Or even maybe disclosures of harassment or bullying elsewhere in the organization, and the client is bringing that because they have some distress about the situation. So how do you choose to handle those? And one thing that we always mention in contracting around ethical dilemmas is, what if you're working with a client who brings a safeguarding issue, either about themselves, so perhaps they are at risk of harm, or that perhaps you suspect that they are at risk of harming others. Now, thankfully, lots of these ethical dilemmas are incredibly rare, but as practitioners, if you do enough coaching, you are going to come across situations that you aren't sure how to handle. and where do you go when you aren't sure how to handle them? And that's what we want to share some questions about today, and talk through some ways that you can do that.
Yeah, and I'm also just thinking, as we're talking about it, about situations where the coach might stand to gain financially from information that they discover through the coaching relationship. Perhaps they've got investments in the organization where they're coaching, or perhaps in an organization that the person they're coaching, are working with. So they get information that they could benefit from financially. And I think that's not perhaps one that people think of, as front of mind, but it certainly has potential to occur in the coaching relationship. So that isn't an exhaustive list that we've given you, but it's just a flavor of things that can come up, as Zoe said, occasionally. So some questions that you can ask yourself. First of all, as coaches, it's really important that we always act from a good heart. And what we mean by that is that we are acting in the client's best interests. They are the center of that relationship. There is a self-care element we'll come on to in a minute, but what would you add, Zoe, about acting from a good heart?
I think it's about intention, so checking in with yourself of where am I coming from here? Am I coming from fear? Am I coming from ego? Am I coming from the client's interest? And just making sure that as you're trying to work out what to do and make decisions, that you're approaching it in a clean way, in that you are thinking about it from the standpoint of what is the right thing to do in this situation, given all of the information that you have.
And the role that I'm occupying.
Yeah.
So secondly, we need to ask ourselves, are we competent to do this work? So if the client is disclosing things to you about themselves that are, different to what they disclosed to you in the chemistry conversation when you agreed to work together, and you notice that you're starting to think, oh, I don't know if I am equipped to do that work, then that's where this comes up. Checking out, is this a lack of confidence? For me as a coach, a new or experienced coach could still feel maybe lacking in confidence, but does that mean you're not competent to do the work?
I think also here, I think we may have mentioned this on a previous podcast, that's where as a coach, as well as obviously managing the ethics, you need to have an awareness of what are the boundaries of your competence. As you try to answer this question, like, am I capable? Do I have the competence? That's not just about your training and your skills. It's about your experience, and also your willingness and your boundaries around what you choose to coach and what you think actually isn't for you to be coaching appropriate. So knowing the boundaries of your competence go hand in hand with that question, I think.
And then we've got the question of, am I keeping faith with the contract? And what that means is, when we start working with a client, we contract with them. So we have an agreement with them as to what we're going to be working on and what do successful outcomes look like as a result of working on those things. Now, in a lot of coaching programs, let's say it's 6 sessions, what the client comes to coaching for initially does tend to develop as they discover more about themselves. And that's where it's important that we recontract, that we check in. This is what we agreed to work on. I hear you talking about this, that this is important to you. Is this what you would like to focus on now in our coaching rather than that? And the client can either say yes or no.
I think also around that, it's who is your contract with, because there can be multi-party contracts, and that's where the conflicts can arise. So you may have a contract with the organization, as I said before, and you also have a contract with your client. And you may find, a few sessions in that something comes up and you think, gosh, I don't think I've actually contracted for that. Perhaps the line manager wants more information around what is happening in the coaching, or the client makes some big decisions and you're holding information whilst also, feeling a duty to that contracting organization. So you may need to go back and do some recontracting to realign and make sure that you're walking the ethics line that you want to be able to walk in that relationship.
And then we've got the question of, am I treating the client fairly? And are they treating me fairly?
Absolutely. I think there are times where you can feel compromised as a coach, not just by your client, but also by the sponsoring organizations. They might step forward and you find yourself in a position where you're handling, opposing pieces of information. Your client may share with you things that you feel uncomfortable holding, whilst you're in that contract. That doesn't mean it's unfair. That's not an automatic decision, but it's often a great litmus test to think, actually, am I comfortable being where I'm at in this relationship right now? And if not, what do I need to do to be able to readjust?
I think some of the things that can happen there are, let's say if the client is always late to a session, and then you start to develop some resentment as the coach, and then you're not showing up for them and able to be present if you don't disclose that to them. Or perhaps you're not treating them fairly because you've got a lot of things going on in your personal life and you're not able to focus 100% and be present in those coaching sessions. So that question is a really interesting one, and it requires us really to discuss with our client, what does fairness look like in our relationship as coach and coachee, and maybe talk about some of the situations that might arise. So that's a really interesting one. And it also leads on to the fact that we have choice as to whether or not we continue to stay in the coaching relationship, and the coachee also has a choice as to whether or not to stay in the coaching relationship. And I love this one because I think reminding ourselves of that, I think I remind myself of that, in advance of each and every coaching session that I have, and in those coaching sessions. And I think it enables me to challenge more, because we are there because we choose to be there.
There is something around the practicalities of ethical dilemmas, that your terms and conditions as a coach, you've got the code of practice that you can go to as a practitioner, but your terms and conditions as a coach play an important part of helping to support you with your ethics as well. So, our terms and conditions, we do talk openly about, coachees may choose to make some big life-altering decisions as a result of the coaching, which can include leaving the organization, even when an organization has chosen to pay. And that is not something we're in control of, because the process is there to support the clients with awareness and growth. And sometimes the place that they come to isn't the same place as what the sponsoring organization may wish them to come to. And if you're in one-to-one coaching, as you've alluded to there, Jo, around lateness, missed sessions, your terms and conditions can really support you to avoid some of the conflicts later down the line. So if you've got a clear cancellation policy or a clear lateness policy, that can, support you to be able to be clear with your client around your boundaries from the get-go, so you can avoid any conflict later down the line.
And then there's that question of, am I taking care of myself, which goes back to what I mentioned earlier, which is, we really need to be able to resource ourselves to do this work, because the work can be really demanding as well as being really rewarding. And if you're coaching more than one client in a day, which lots of coaches do, then you need the ability and the energy reserves, and to be able to, do the preparation for each client, put your own life to one side, be present in that relationship follow-up, if you send notes or the things that you do, and be able to leave that client and that client's work in that session, which is more challenging than it sounds, so that you can then be ready, take a break and then be ready to, fully honor your next client.
The code of ethics are, well-written documents, but they can be ambiguous. I think we mentioned earlier, it comes down to interpretation. There is no coaching big brother that is there to tell you that you've done something wrong or that you should have done something differently. It really comes down to us as coaching practitioners to make those decisions and to interpret the code of ethics as one go-to place. But there are other go-to places that we can get for support with ethical dilemmas, such as supervision. I've reached out to my supervisor recently to discuss my own ethical dilemma. And again, a supervisor isn't there to say, yes, do this, no, do that. They're there to help support your thinking and your construction of your decision making. And actually, one of the models that we teach on our coaching programs is the ethics model, which is by Ling and Hawke. And that is a model that helps us to interpret the code of ethics and think about how we move forward. So maybe we'll just talk through that briefly, Jo, and share the different points of that to give people an idea of how to do it.
Yeah, so it's an acronym. So the E of ethics stands for evaluating the dilemma.
Yeah. So evaluating the dilemma is about thinking through, as you would do, all of the different angles. How did you arrive at this situation? What is happening? What's in the best interest of my client? What's in my best interest? What are some of the options that I have here? So really doing a thorough kind of think through of evaluation. Would you think anything else? Would you add anything else to that, Jo?
Yeah, I think that's right. The T is about thinking ahead. So it's about evaluating the outcomes, all of the different potential outcomes that there might be of that, and thinking then about what are my other options here.
Yeah, and I think thinking things through in terms of what are the possible outcomes will help you to obviously look back to make the best choice. But you don't do that alone, because the H stands for help, and that is where you may go to your supervisor, you may go to your peers. Perhaps you'd even go to research, reading around the different dilemmas that have emerged to source extra information to see what you can feed into your decision-making process so far.
And that's where the H and the I in ethics kind of overlap. The H is for help, going, as you said, to people that might be able to give you a different perspective, and being aware of the limitations of your own analytical skills, particularly when you are emotionally involved in the situation that you're in. And then the I is thinking about, okay, well, what's typical in these situations? What do people normally do? Is there any writing or research about this? And I remember early on in my career, I was faced with an ethical dilemma, and I didn't know where to go. I'd been through my training, but I spoke to, well, I researched first of all, because that's normally what I do, because I want to get, find my own answers. I don't want to, and then I went to more than one supervisor actually, and I couldn't believe that they couldn't give me an answer. I thought, like in other professions, there's like, do this, don't do that, especially coming from a HR background where there's so much, legal framework, so many legal frameworks around. And I felt really alone and abandoned, in the sense that it's almost like that reality that we do to some extent operate in a vacuum. We have these sessions, these confidential sessions with people. And in the end, I made my decision. I couldn't do anything else. I did the research. I asked other people, confidential, obviously not sharing the client's information, and it all worked out fine. And it was a really important learning experience for me.
Yeah, and that I think kind of articulates the C in the ethics model, which is calculating the risk, isn't it? Like you can talk, you can do all of this, you talk to all these people, you can do your research, you can get help and support. Ultimately, it's going to come down to you to make that decision and be okay with the possible outcomes that may do. And sometimes ethical dilemmas, it's not about the fact that there's a good outcome, because if it's a situation where you're faced with, I don't know, needing to continue the coaching or needing to not continue the coaching, actually both of those can have consequences that don't feel good. You might feel like if you say no to continuing the coaching that you're abandoning your client. You may feel that you have had a real competence gap, that you should have been able to continue the coaching and deal with it. Or if you continue the coaching, your skills might feel stretched. You might be talking about topics that are uncomfortable for you, so there's not necessarily a beautifully wrapped up, tidy answer to ethical dilemmas. Ultimately, it's about calculating the risk and being prepared to take the learning, which will make you into a better practitioner as you move forward.
And then the final step in the ethics model by Ling and Hawke is selecting your course of action, which ultimately is about decision making. One option is you do nothing. One option, and that maybe is also about continuing to do what you were already doing. And obviously the other options are to do something differently. And ultimately it comes down to you as a coaching professional to make that decision and to have been through all of the steps beforehand. And the reason the model is there is to just help to provide a semi-structure for your thinking, because when you encounter an ethical dilemma, particularly for the first time, it's almost like you can go into a nosedive, spinning around in your thinking. And, in a session, you've got those moment by moment, time points to be able to make a decision. And the obvious thing to do is to be honest with your client. Say, this sounds like something that I need to take to supervision, or I want to take to supervision? Are you happy for me to do that? The reason I'm thinking about doing that is because X, Y, and Z. And so seeking permission from your client or involving them in that situation, and think about what it is you want to model in that relationship and what it is that they're coming to coaching for, and to what extent does this ethical dilemma that you might be presented representative of something else that's going on in your client's life. So, you know, for many coaches, it actually gets to the stage when you're more experienced of becoming more exciting when an ethical dilemma arises.
Oh, they're definitely learning opportunities, aren't they? And you know, chances to really tap into your experience and how well developed your coach judgment has become. And you know, as you were chatting there, Joe, I was just thinking, we often get asked, don't we, by people who have been leaders for a long time, or mentors, or strategists, or coaches in the online industry, like, do I really need a coaching qualification? Like, is that something that I really need? And I think ethics is one of the areas why high quality coaching and training and CPD are so important, because ethics isn't like a one-stop shop in a coaching training. Throughout your whole entire coaching training, you're being guided around, here are some situations which might be a conflict, and here are not. And your coach judgment and being able to work ethically, being aware of the psychodynamics that take place between coach and coachee. And as you were alluding to there, Joe, like the wider system and how that shows up in relationship, you can't develop that on your own. You know, I certainly couldn't have developed that on my own. If it wasn't for my coach training and all the CPD I've done, there's no way I could even sit here and have this conversation with you today. So yeah, from our perspective, coaching training is 100% essential. And not because it's about box ticking, but you don't know what you don't know. And why wouldn't you want to be the absolute best coach that you could be?
So if you are listening and you think, right, well, I think I want to get myself trained as a coach, and I want to do an accredited coaching training program, you can find out more about our coaching training programs at igcompany.co.uk.